Welcome to Brea Talks, bringing you straightforward, accessible content from industry leaders and experts with no agendas or decisions to make. Just important topics affecting all of us and how they specifically apply to Brea. We'll clear out the noise, debunk myths, and give helpful, concise information. So now we invite you to listen in as Brea Talks.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Brea Talks. Tonight, Brea Talks, Hillside, Design, Development, and I'm Dave Crabtree, Community Development Director for the City of Brea, and I'm joined tonight by Mr. Mark Rogers. Mark is principal with TRG Land in Costa Mesa, a leader in hillside development issues in California and the western United States. And Mark's work advises private development clients as well as cities and local government how to achieve sensitive and sustainable approaches to development in the hills. Mark, thanks for joining me. And let's kind of get right into it. I'd like to talk to you tonight about how we got here, the issues that we face considering hillside development, what that might mean for Brea, what some of the myths and facts are, opportunities for the future, and we've worked together long enough that I know you've got a lot of history to tell us about. But speaking of that history, how did we get here? Let's get into it a bit.
Sure, and I want to thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. We've known each other for 30 years and done a lot of work together, and I'm very pleased to be here with you tonight. So thank you. What I'd like to start with, Dave, I'm going to break this into two major sections. One is contextual, and I want to put some color to what hillside development has evolved from and has evolved to, which I think is important to develop a mindset about what we're experiencing with hillside development in a contemporary building environment. So I'm going to start us back in Southern California. Around the turn of the century, the major industries in Southern California were basically citrus, agriculture, and oil. And Brea, very much a very early pioneer in oil exploration, I think preceded a lot of the major oil companies in California. But because agriculture was really a dominant land use in California, hillside development was really meant for the people who owned the orchards and conducted their business. So development occurred in hillside areas that we're familiar with today in Los Angeles, like Pasadena, San Marino, Glendale, in a very incremental fashion. And I call it hillside romantic. And the reason I call it that is we hearken to a romantic ideal of what hillside development has been and what's attractive to us. And what happened back in those days, one house would be built, and 10 years later another house would be built. And the fabric or patina of hillside was a process that happened over a long period of time. So what came with that were diversity of land use patterns. Things weren't really linear. Landscape architecture was a significant component of these homes in these hillside areas because they were usually larger homes for the people who actually owned the orchards. Architecture was an important ingredient back then, and we can go back to Pasadena and look at countless examples of great architecture that was very individualistic. It didn't form a monotonous pattern. And one of the interesting visual pieces I brought to share tonight is this beautiful book. It's called California Calls You. And this book was put together based on in the oil production industry trying to attract people to come to California. And so these beautiful illustrations, almost like Maxwell Parrish illustrations, were produced that made California and the environment look absolutely irresistible. And
I want to live there.
And,
right?
and it was probably pretty true to form. Mm-hmm. This is what predated a lot of the development as we know it today. So without getting too long on the history side of this, what happened is the major changing force to development in California was the post-war boom. So picture, if you will, hundreds of thousands of GIs coming to California, training for the Pacific Theater from places like Iowa, and I'm not casting any aspersions on Iowa or Michigan or places in the Midwest or the Northeast, but a lot of people came through California in the 40s, and went to serve the country in the Pacific Theater, and guess what they did? When they came back, they stayed, and for good reason. We all live here and appreciate the wonderful environment. And it was a very attractive opportunity for GIs with the GI Bill to buy houses. And so what we began to see was the evolution of tract housing. Tract housing was, instead of building one or two houses in a neighborhood, which was often the style of builders, they would buy a few lots and build a few houses, sell them, go buy a few more lots, build some houses, sell them. What began to happen was we were building houses in mass. So marching south from Los Angeles in the flat basin, and remember, geographically, there's a huge plain between fundamentally the Santa Monica Mountains and the San Joaquin Hills that are the southern reaches of Orange County. And that whole expanse, with the exception of Palos Verdes Peninsula, Signal Hill, and the Puente Formation, was virtually flat ground given to mainly agricultural production. What began to happen with the GI Bill and the huge amount of buying power that the GIs had, we began to build hundreds of homes at a time. It changed the industry. And I'd like to make note here, we are still a very young industry. We talk about the sophistication that we're at today has evolved in very rapid time. Since I came into the industry in 1979, there have been huge sweeping changes to how we do development, how we understand development, and we'll get into that on the back half. But as these blocks of homes, hundreds at a time, march south, creating the communities that we see today in Los Angeles, they began to ultimately fill up the valley, and the next logical place for housing to occur in mass was going to be Hillsides. So it's kind of a turning point. The late 40s and early 50s marked a point in time where development in its totality changed and mass housing, production housing, became the dominant form of development in California. I think it's important to recognize that production housing characteristically was built to be cheap. It was built to serve the middle class. And as we began to move into developments in Hillsides, we began to incur greater costs. Almost absent the kind of science that we have today, developments were put into hillside areas almost as though they were on flat ground. And it's interesting, you can go back and look at communities that were built, and I still deal with them, and even in Los Angeles County, that go back to those eras, and they're quirky. You know, they tried their best, but there were no real standards. There wasn't a sense of design control. They were pretty much mavericks, and they cobbled together these communities and hillsides that oftentimes were not that attractive and not that well thought out.
Well, I imagine that then started getting folks' attention of, gosh, look at that on the hill, as contrasted to your earlier example of that, more romantic time.
Correct. Yeah. And I think what is somewhat self-evident is when we put production housing on a hill in the absence of a lot of the considerations that we make today, one, it's none too attractive, and two, it doesn't really possess all those elements that I explained earlier, which is subdivision and land form, landscape architecture, and architecture. Pretty much cookie cutter homes, often gable ends oriented out, no articulation, architectural articulation. And because it's foisted up in front of everybody, as opposed to flat ground development, which is generally a parkway edge can mitigate for a lot of the things that happen behind that parkway and wall. Hillside development's there for everybody to see. And over time, I think people's expectations of what it should be really began to evolve. I think people felt they had skin in the game. This was their community. They were looking at it. They felt it affected the integrity of their communities. The earliest examples of that, I think, are places like Claremont, who produced some of the very earliest hillside management ordinances I'm familiar with that were of quality.
Well, and that's probably, and I may be getting ahead of you here, but it feels like that's almost some of the transition that got Brea's attention when we were introduced those 30 some years ago.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep. So my introduction, meeting you, Dave, in 1989 was the visioning process that was pretty landmark for any city in Southern California, where the city leadership brought together constituents. I think there were 150 volunteers in the community.
Sounds right.
They were led by a gentleman who I'll never forget, Daniel Icofano of MIG. He's the I in the MIG, which is all sort of disbanded. But I'll never forget the way Daniel created consensus in bringing together all the ideas that the citizenry had for what should happen in the Hillside area of Brea.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I was a bit player. We didn't have a large role. I was doing computer modeling and trying to help everybody understand visually what was going on. We were, in that particular firm I was a partner in, sort of introducing computer modeling to Hillside development, which was important because we could really start to develop expectations a little bit more clearly on the part of the constituents. So let's talk about some of the tools we created in Brea. I think it's probably among the more proud things I have to look back on in my career was the experiences I had here affecting the outcome by way of policy in these very important areas of Hillside development.
Well, and the walkthrough of those tools is important. I wanted to kind of capture some of that, so I appreciate you wanting to head there, because it's one of those where we expect as a community to be facing some of those Hillside projects in the coming years, and so this is a great primer for not only our staff to hear this podcast and see the video, but our appointed and elected officials as well, and our community. So, and not to mention the developers that are out there that will be coming in, knocking on our door.
Sure. So we had 2 visioning sessions. I believe the one that culminated in '92 was the first one.
Sounds right.
And I think we had another one sometime about 10 years later.
Yeah.
It was sort of an affirmation of the visioning that occurred at the first one. But I just have to say, Brea to me is one of the more contemporary, forward-thinking communities that I've dealt with. I deal with a lot of communities on the public side as well as the private side. And it's always been sort of the cornerstone, I think, of the success of this community, which is, I think, a testament to what has happened and will continue to happen in the city of Brea. We also were involved with you in doing the general plan update, and I believe that was in 2009.
2003.
I'm sorry, 2003.
Yep.
And I'm bad on dates, but...
That's why I'm here, Mark.
Thank you, David. Save me. And what that was a goal-setting exercise and really trying to capture not only policy and goals for the areas that were in the corporate boundary of Brea, but also the areas of influence. We call the sphere of influence. Brea is kind of unique that it is a joining of 3 counties, which is very unusual. We're just short of getting Riverside in there, but I think about Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and Orange County culminate in these hillside areas that are a backdrop to the city.
Right.
So it was the intent of the leadership to provide guidance to those communities, those counties, that would hear projects that would affect Brea and hopefully get consideration for what the city saw was a vision for those hillside communities as well. Probably the landmark document that I think we created was the Hillside zoning ordinance. And let's just talk about that a little bit. We can debate this, and it's always fun when I see you, David, who came up with the term predictable outcome. And maybe it's neither of us. I think it's me. Could be you, but
yeah, we don't have that much time, Mark. Yeah.
So we came up with this term.
I like to think it was a collaboration.
It probably was a collaboration. We always work so well together. Yeah. So we called it predictable outcome, and it's a great term.
It is.
I think it's an appropriate term to describe what the Hillside zoning ordinance accomplished. And we also coined the phrase science forward. So you're looking at a kid that is when I was a young man, I was a geeky, brought home fossils, every living creature you imagine, like a natural scientist, Tom Sawyer-esque existence. I hate to think I contributed to the Endangered Species Act, but I might have. I never killed animals, but I had all animals as pets at one point in my life, and I scavenged the hills of Southern California to find them. So I'm a real fan of natural science. My minor in school was geology, loved geology. But what we understand about development going forward from about the time, 2004, when we adopted this ordinance, was people could get entitlements on a map. And what the map had to do was basically draw lots, grade it, kind of have a notion of what was going to happen, provide some basis for environmental clearance under SEQA, which at the time was still fairly stringent, but the map would be approved and we would all go forward with an understanding that was a given number of units and in development on a particular property. But the problem with that process was it never vetted the real science that create the underpinnings of how development is actually placed on ground. One of the tools in the Hillside zoning ordinance was a slope density formula.
My favorite.
And it's a very simple guide that says if a property's average slope is pitched at a varying percentage, you can create so much flat ground on it. Believe me, I'm no math whiz, but I get this. With return slopes of 2 to 1, 50%, you have a finite amount of ground you can create on any given sloping property. And it was meant to act as a guide to, I'll call it an aiming tool, which is one of my favorite terms to use, to provide decision makers and maybe developers with an opportunity to really understand how much of that property is in development, how much property needs to be set aside for environmental issues, resource agency issues, and then other land takes that occur within a development, which are basins.
Our water quality issues.
Water quality,
right?
water tanks and utilities and all the things that are construct that need to be accounted for in a development to really measure the net entitlement that you can achieve.
So all those real constraints, where are they and what are the true opportunities? That whole more detailed opportunities and constraints with the science.
Yep. And the science forward. And the importance of this is decision makers and lay people who aren't steeped in this 24/7 like we are looking at a body of information foreign to them. Most of these people are not trained professionals in land development or any of the associated sciences, and they're making decisions about land holding capacity on very limited science.
Yeah.
And so what we wanted to ensure was what decisions were made were informed decisions that the public and the electeds could feel confident when the gavel went down on either approval or denial of a project. It was based on real information.
That whole science was so important to the work. And can you talk a little bit about the requirements that we came up with for just an application?
Sure.
May seem to the untrained eye, to your point, onerous even or exhaustive, but so critical.
So in 2004, we were actually, we had to force people into spending this money. The money's getting spent. It's just when it gets spent.
Yeah.
And so with predictable outcome with that term, we want the money spent on the front end so that when the project's approved, we know it can actually be built.
Right.
There's an incredible amount of time and energy that cities go into to manage their growth through a general plan process, and they have to account for entitlement. Entitlements that are on the books guide the city's direction in terms of employment, services, all the things that go into a city budget.
Right.
And if we're putting entitlements on the book that will never be built, we're doing a great disservice to the city and their citizens forecasting development that really can't be built. A great example of that is we, in effect, decommissioned the Carbon Canyon specific plan that in earnest in the 80s, early 80s was probably a wonderfully contemporary plan.
Best tool, yeah, at
Best
that time.
we could come up with in the 80s, and it had close to 1,800 units in Carbon Canyon.
We knew more in the modern times.
We have since discovered that most of that ground
and
is...
we may know more in the future. But
we were able to provide guidance to those landowners and decommission quite a few of those units, which is a great benefit to the city at large, not having to account for that for public services and going forward with development.
And to be clear, the actual science was never going to see those units realized. Right.
It was, I think, one of the more effective academic public exercises I've been involved with. I was very proud of that. Yeah. But to your point, today, in 2004, you were bending people's arms behind their back to get them to come up with the overall basin sizes, water quality requirements, set-asides for resource agency issues, And probably as important as anything, we were really just getting into geomorphology, where you really had to do a lot of significant testing on a hillside property to determine whether the property could sustain the development from a geotechnical standpoint. I've worked in the Puente Hills, which is the hill formation that creates the backdrop in much of Brea, Yorba Linda, City of Industry, going all the way up. And it is among the most unstable geotechnical regions in Southern California. This is why we find oil seeping out of the ground, being pushed up through faults, where we have the Inglewood Fault. We have, a series of geotechnical things that are going on here that make this a very tenuous environment to do development. Probably more important than any place else in Southern California is the geotechnical component of development than right here in Brea and the Puente Hills. So in 2004, there was a great deal of resistance to doing these types of things. With some clients, there will continue to be that resistance. Nobody wants to spend the money early. But back in that day, the concept was you could get a map approved with scant information. It would be a monetization of that property.
That's right.
So the property value would come up 5-fold at minimum, sometimes 10-fold with the entitlement. And those people, we call them flippers, would take that tract map and flip it to the next guy. And they'd make the money and walk away, and the next guy would be left with that map, and then, assuming he's going to develop it, would eventually be appealing to the governing body because he was sold a map that said 100 units, but when he gets all the signs together, it only makes 50. Can I do 100 on that?
Yeah.
And so we got into this conundrum where maps were not really achievable because the science wasn't there to support it. Today, we have a much different environment for doing projects. By and large, most of the funding for development comes from Wall Street. So most of the major builders, with a few exceptions, I think Shea is one of them, maybe one other, are funded out of Wall Street. So they're accountable to shareholders. These people are very risk adverse. They'd like to see a nice return on their money, but they don't want to lose their money because somebody's being aggressive with a development project, taking risks. So risk management's a big part of development today. What I'm finding in the more contemporary environment, if you want to sell a map, it has to come with most everything that we now have built into this Hillside zoning ordinance. Otherwise, the buyer's not there. They don't want to incur the risk of vetting 3 to 5 years of time and energy to provide the basis of science to support the map.
So hopefully our efforts are getting, the reality is maybe there's more reception for them in the industry because of those. They're being a little more careful. Are you finding that in your practice?
I find it to be true with the smart guys. And I think it's become a different arena. You can't be in this business and be offhanded, uninformed, flippant. And I haven't even gotten into constituency, which I'm going to leave out of this conversation, which is a huge factor in this community, which is a very important factor in this community.
Mark, the other thing I wanted to make sure we touched on is we talk a lot about the science, and it realizes us of the vision that we see out there. But an important part of the work we did was that vision and taking our decision makers, the planning commissioners, the city council out to these sites to see what is the vision that you want for the Brea Hills. If we are going to allow some level of development in our hills, what does it want to be? And refresh my memory on some of that a little bit.
So among the more fun things that we got to do as we were crafting the ordinance, and let me just say, I feel like the luckiest guy in the world for so many reasons. But among them that I've had the experiences I've had professionally, and I've gotten to work with the best people. Projects that you can't even get close to in terms of their quality. And a lot of those were on the Irvine Ranch, and we employed all of the things to create predictable outcome in projects on the ranch because, quite frankly, they had the horsepower, they had the money, and they had a man leading the charge, Donald Bren, who understood this, and he knew that if he's going to do it, he's got to do it right. So we were very fortunate to have empirical examples of policy and standards in place. And we could go to communities that we had worked shoulder to shoulder with the best people in the business. No one person does this stuff. It's a team, it's a village. But we could point at things and say, you know, we have an idea for an on-lot tree program. Let me show you a project that's accomplished that. Let me show you how different it looks than all the more regular projects that you might envision for hillside communities. We could show them things like, we call them super slopes, where there's a great accounting. If you cut your terraces at 28 feet, it's just high enough to where the house behind you can see over your house. Of course, the problem with that is when you plant a tree and it grows into that view shed, everybody's angry. Countless communities are dealing with dissension regarding trees and want to cut them all down. Palos Verdes Estates, Laguna, I could go on and on. So we found ways to create enough room and vertical space in projects to have landscape architecture, which is a huge, important ingredient in creating the patina and that romantic vision that I think makes people appreciate a hillside development. And those opportunities of taking your decision makers and staff to the projects, in spite of some bus problems we had, to show them the good, bad, and the ugly about hillside development was a great opportunity to contrast the typical way of doing it and the way that we were able to craft the zoning ordinance around that predictable outcome model.
Well, it takes me back to your earlier words of, Southern California. You started with that notion of hillside romantic. It became bad hillside tracks. Taking our decision makers out and having those tours of, the good, the bad, and the ugly really brought this home and allowed us to craft that tool that has served us well to date. And so, and hopefully into the future. But, as we go forward here as a community, what do you think the future holds for us in terms of, will we see developers knocking on our door for more hillside development, and do we have the right tools in place?
Well, first of all, we are woefully behind in providing housing in Southern California. I think we're 10 million units behind right now. There's an urgent need for housing in all communities. So yeah, we're going to continue to have pressure. I think that the state is forcing the pressure into transit-oriented areas that have mass transit, which is logical. I think we're going to see more vertical and less greenfield development. But no, the hillsides are an incredibly important resource for landowners that own them, those hillside areas. There's incredible value if you can achieve hillside communities, because I've worked on projects where the base price of the lot was $1.5 million, the view was worth $10 million.
Yeah.
And I'm talking, that's crazy stuff, but that's part of the economy of doing hillside development is you get a real bump in the value of the property if you do it well. And so, yeah, there will continue to be pressure. I'm already adopting techniques to deal with fire suppression and planning for communities in hillside areas that have a different approach to dealing with fire suppression and fire access. I think that's going to come after last year's fires, 16,000 units lost, are going to be an important consideration going forward. So wildland interface, urban and wildland interface is going to continue to rear up its head and force us to really consider how we manage that. So yeah, we'll continue to have that pressure. I think there's a finite amount of hillside for Brea to develop, so we're kind of on the tail end until we get into the county pieces. We're kind of on the tail end of that, but certainly there will be more and more pressure put on development in all areas of Southern California.
Very good. One of the things and you and I talked about before getting into this session was, of the topics we've covered on Brea Talks, this one, and particularly with us both having these conversations over 30 years, we could talk a lot on this topic.
Yeah, I could take another hour of your time.
Trying to pack this into a condensed 30 minutes is a challenge, but one of the things I always like to do with our guests is kind of give you the LW, the last word, and what you might leave me with, a snippet of wisdom about hillsides, or anything that comes to mind, and even if it's just to reference, other materials that our listeners might check into, or what do you got for me of a bit of a wrap up?
Well, if you've ever seen any of my presentations, I finish on one slide, and it's these two boots on a soapbox. And underneath it, it's expectations. And the reason I love that is I am a soapbox guy. I love to talk about my craft. But I think the principal thing that we should all be aware of, not only for these types of issues, but all issues, expectations. What do we expect from one another? I don't care if it's your relationship with your wife, your children, your workmates, or what we expect from one another in engaging in the development of any project in any city. And I think the importance of what we've accomplished, Dave, and I'm most proud of the work I've done with your city, of all the things I've done. It's been very gratifying, and I thank you. Is that I think we've provided a basis for developing the right expectations and providing your decision makers and constituents with a tool to help them understand when a developer comes in, what they should expect when he walks away, turns the last key on the door that he sold, and is out of town, because that's what they do. What's left? And that expectation of what we should expect from them is a very important component of what we go forward with the tools we've created here in other areas of Southern California and the Western United States. So that's my big bugaboo. Let's be sure we've developed the right expectations of one another, so we're not disappointed when we get to the end of the story.
Well, and I can tell you, Mark, it's never a disappointment for me to engage with you in these discussions. It's been rewarding as always. Appreciate the time. And for our folks at home, thanks so much for tuning in and listening. And please be sure to stay tuned as Brea Talks. Again, we'll have a new episode coming to you soon. Thanks so much. Good night.